The words hit Maggie Sawyer like a bucket of ice water pulled fresh from a winter well. I need a woman who can cook, mend, keep a clean house, and not ask too many questions. Wallace Barker stood at the far end of the kitchen table, his hat in his hands, his jaw set like carved stone. That is all I am looking for. That is all I have ever been looking for. I made that plain in the letter. I thought you understood. Maggie stood very still. The candle on the table between them threw flickering shadows across his face, and for one long, terrible moment she could not speak. She had ridden 3 days on a rattling stagecoach from Abilene, Kansas, through dust and heat, and a thunderstorm that had nearly swallowed the road whole. She had arrived in Harlow, New Mexico Territory in 1882 with 1 carpetbag, 2 dresses, a worn Bible, and what she had told herself was the reasonable, practical hope of a new life. She had not expected him to be so handsome. She had not expected that to hurt. "I understood your letter perfectly," she said, and her voice was steadier than anything else in her body. "You wanted a practical arrangement. I agreed to a practical arrangement." "Then why," Wallace said, and his voice dropped to something rougher, something almost dangerous, "did you bring books?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. I watched the driver haul your bag inside. Something heavy hit the floor. I looked." He gestured toward the bedroom doorway. 3 books. A woman who brings 3 books to a working cattle ranch is not thinking practically. Maggie stared at him. Then, because she was Maggie Sawyer and she had survived things that would have broken lesser people, she lifted her chin. "I also brought a cast iron skillet, 2 balls of wool, a bone-handled knife, and enough dried herbs to stock a decent medicine shelf. Would you like to inventory those as well, Mr. Barker?" Something moved behind his eyes. It was gone so fast she nearly missed it. "I'll show you the house rules in the morning," he said. "You can take the bedroom. I sleep in the barn loft when the weather permits." He put on his hat, turned, and walked out the front door into the dark New Mexico night, leaving Maggie alone with the candle and the silence and the very distinct feeling that she had just walked into something far more complicated than a practical arrangement. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table. She pressed her palms flat against the rough wood. She breathed. And she told herself with great firmness that she was absolutely, completely, entirely not going to fall in love with Wallace Barker. She had told herself similar things before. She was, as history would show, not always right. 6 weeks earlier, Maggie Sawyer had been sitting in the back office of the Abilene Ladies' Aid Society, reading a posted notice on the community board with the focused attention of someone who was running out of options. She was 26 years old. She was educated, having attended the Topeka Female Seminary for 2 years before her father's death had called her home to run his general store. She had run that store alone for 3 years, keeping the books, managing the inventory, negotiating with suppliers who often did not want to negotiate with a woman. She had been good at it. She had been, her regular customers said, the sharpest mind in the county. And then the bank had come. It was not a dramatic story. It was a devastatingly ordinary one. Her father had taken a loan against the store during a lean year, and the loan had compounding interest, and the interest had eaten the principal alive. And when Maggie had finally dug deep enough into the old ledgers to find the hidden debt, it was already too late. The bank held the deed. She had 30 days to vacate. She had $31.14 to her name. She had sat at that community board for a long time. There were 3 notices for women willing to accept domestic positions in St. Louis. There was one for a boarding house in Denver that offered room and board in exchange for cleaning and cooking. And there was one, written in a precise, economical hand on plain white paper, that read as follows: Rancher, widower, Harlow, New Mexico Territory. Seeking a capable woman for marriage in name and domestic partnership. No romantic expectations. Must be practical, competent, and willing to work. Honest correspondence required. Write to W. Barker, Box 14, Harlow Post. She had read it 4 times. Then she had gone home, sat at her father's writing desk, and written the most honest letter of her life. She told him she was 26, which was considered well past marrying age by most of Abilene's social standards, a fact she mentioned without apology. She told him she could cook, though she was better at preserving and canning than at baking. She told him she had kept financial records for a general store for 3 years and could manage household accounts without error. She told him she was healthy, had no living family, and had no illusions about romance. She also told him she read books because she figured a man who wanted honesty deserved honesty, even the inconvenient kind. He had written back in 8 days, which was fast for the territory. His letter was exactly 12 sentences long. It confirmed the arrangement, gave her a date, enclosed $4 for stagecoach fare, and ended with, "I will meet you at the Harlow station. There will be no need for courtship or ceremony of any kind. The territorial justice can see to the legal matter the morning after your arrival." 12 sentences. No greeting, no closing pleasantry. She had thought, reading it, this is a man who has decided to feel nothing. She had packed her bag, tucked her 3 books inside Homer's Odyssey, a worn copy of Jane Eyre she had read 4 times, and a medical reference guide she had used when her father was sick, and climbed aboard the westbound stage. Now she sat in the kitchen of a working cattle ranch in Harlow, New Mexico, in August of 1882, and she was not going to fall in love. The house, she discovered in the morning light, was larger than she had expected and more neglected. It was a solid 2-story adobe structure built in the Spanish style that was common in the territory, with thick walls that kept the heat out and a deep covered porch that ran the full length of the front. Inside, the rooms were functional and dusty. The kitchen had a good iron stove and a dry sink with a pump that needed priming. The parlor had 2 chairs, a table, and no curtains. The bedroom she had been given had a bed frame, a straw mattress that had seen better years, and a window that looked out over the south pasture. There was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece in the parlor. A woman, young and serious-faced, with her hair pinned very neatly. Maggie looked at it for a moment and then looked away. Wallace Barker appeared at the kitchen door at 6 in the morning, hat already on, smelling of hay and horses. He was, she observed with objective clarity, a strongly built man of perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair that was just beginning to gray at the temples and deep-set eyes the color of weathered cedar. His face was the face of someone who had spent years in the sun and the wind, all clean angles and hard planes. He had a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, that disappeared into the shadow of his stubble. He looked at the table. She had set it for 2. There was coffee, eggs fried with the salt pork she had found in the larder, and cornbread made from a sack of meal she had located in the back of the pantry. He looked at it for a moment as though he was not sure what to do with it. "Justice Coleman comes by on Thursdays," he said, sitting down. "That is 2 days from now. We can make it legal then." "That is fine," Maggie said. "I have 4 ranch hands. They eat at the bunkhouse. You will not need to cook for them." "All right. I leave before sunrise most days. I will be back by supper. I will have supper ready." He picked up his fork. He ate. He said nothing else. Maggie poured herself coffee and ate her own breakfast and looked out the window at the morning spreading across the southern New Mexico landscape, all ochre and gold, and the deep purple shadows of the Manzano Mountains in the far distance. It was, she thought, honestly beautiful. Whatever else this was, it was beautiful. She caught him watching her when she turned back to the table. He looked down at his plate immediately. She decided not to mention it. Justice Coleman came on Thursday as promised, a round, cheerful man in his 60s who shook Maggie's hand and told her she had good handshake for a woman, which she accepted as the compliment he clearly intended it to be. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took 4 minutes. Wallace said the required words in the same flat tone he used for everything. Maggie said hers clearly and without trembling, which she counted as a personal victory. Coleman wished them well, took the $2 Wallace gave him for his trouble and rode off toward town. Wallace turned back toward the barn. Wallace, she said, because she had decided to use his given name since they were now legally bound and she saw no reason for unnecessary formality. He stopped. Do you have an account at the Harlow Mercantile? A pause. Yes. I would like to go to town today and assess what we need for the household. I will make a list first so we are not wasteful about it. Another pause, longer. He seemed to be running calculations. You'll need the wagon. I can have Denny hitch it. I can hitch a wagon, thank you. He turned and looked at her then fully for the first time since the night she had arrived. There was something in his expression she could not quite name. Not admiration exactly, not surprise exactly. Something between the two with a third thing underneath it that she was not ready to identify. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. She made her list. She hitched the wagon with assistance from his youngest ranch hand, a boy of 20 named Denny Kraft who had cheerful red hair and an easy smile, and who talked constantly while he helped her check the harness. She drove the 2 miles into Harlow, which was a small but established town with a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a post office, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, and a mercantile that smelled of leather and dried beans and tobacco. The woman behind the counter at the mercantile introduced herself as Pearl Harmon, wife of the owner, a small, precise woman with sharp eyes and the kind of warm manner that immediately communicated genuine interest in other people. You must be Wallace's new wife, Pearl said, and there was something carefully neutral in her voice, not unkind but measured. Maggie Barker, Maggie said, because that was her name now, and she said it simply without ceremony. Pearl's careful neutrality softened. Welcome to Harlow, then. Wallace runs the box B alone mostly, has since. She stopped. Well, for a while now. I understand he was widowed, Maggie said. Pearl nodded. Clara, 2 years ago, fever took her. It was very hard. She paused. He was very hard after. Maggie did not push. She gave Pearl her list and let the conversation settle into the comfortable practicalities of supply and price, and she drove home with flour, salt, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and a small jar of honey she had bought with 2 pennies of her own remaining money, because honey was not practical and she did not care. The following days settled into a rhythm. Maggie cooked, cleaned, and began attacking the years of accumulated neglect in the house with systematic ferocity. She scrubbed the floors. She aired the mattress and found a better one in storage upstairs. She mended the kitchen curtains she found folded in a chest and hung them in the window. She reorganized the pantry, found that Wallace had been paying twice what he should for several household goods, and quietly drew up a comparison of prices from the mercantile that would save them money. She left it on the table one evening with a note. The Harmon Mercantile charges 11 cents per pound for coffee. The supply wagon that comes through from Las Cruces charges 8. We could order in quantity and save approximately $2 per month. She found the note tucked into his coat pocket 3 days later when she was doing the mending. He had written 2 words on the bottom in his tight, careful script. Noted. Done. She told herself this was not endearing. She was not entirely successful. The thing was, the more she saw of Wallace Barker, the more she understood that what he was not cold. He was careful. There was a significant difference. He was careful with his horses, always patient, always steady with his hands. He was careful with his workers, fair to the point of being demanding about fairness, which she heard in the way Denny Kraft talked about him, with the clear admiration of a young man who respected someone deeply. He was careful with the land, walking the pasture edges after rain to check drainage, checking fence lines himself rather than delegating. He was careful with money, not out of meanness but out of the precise understanding of someone who had built a working ranch from almost nothing and knew exactly how fragile prosperity was. He was careful about everything, except conversation. About conversation, he seemed to have given up entirely. It was Denny Kraft who first cracked the silence open, though not deliberately. Denny had a habit of eating his lunch on the porch steps with his legs dangling, and he started talking to Maggie through the kitchen window one afternoon while she was making preserves. "Boss is different since you came," he said. with the blunt honesty of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to be tactful. Maggie stirred her pot. Different how? He ate supper inside last night. Denny seemed to find this remarkable. He hasn't eaten inside since, he trailed off. Since a while. He is allowed to eat wherever he chooses, Maggie said. Sure, Denny agreed. He was quiet for a moment. He was real sad after Mrs. Barker died. The first one, I mean, Clara. I was only 18 when I came to work here, but I remember thinking I'd never seen a man look so. He seemed to search for the word. Empty? Maggie kept her hands moving. I expect grief does that. He stopped fixing things up. The house, I mean, just let it go. Denny looked at the clean windows, the mended porch steps she had nailed back down herself that morning. You've done a lot already. The house needed it. Sure, another pause. He watches you, you know. When you're out in the kitchen garden and he rides back in, he kind of just looks. Maggie did not respond to that. She focused on her preserves. She did not think about what her face was doing. The first real conversation she had with Wallace happened in the third week, entirely by accident. She was in the parlor late at night, after supper, sitting by the lamp with Jane Eyre, because she had read it 4 times and it still held her completely. She had not expected him to come back in from the barn. He usually stayed out late checking things over, and so she was startled when the door opened and he came in, stopped and looked at her. He looked at the book. He looked at her. That is the one with the madwoman in the attic, he said. Maggie stared at him. You have read Jane Eyre. He looked mildly offended. My mother had a copy. I was ill one winter when I was 14. I read everything in the house. What did you think of Rochester? She asked, because she genuinely could not help it. He sat down in the other chair. It was the first time he had voluntarily sat in the same room with her when there was no practical reason to do so. He set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his dark hair and said, with absolute seriousness, I thought he was manipulative and self-serving, and used Jane's emotions against her deliberately. Maggie felt something warm and entirely inconvenient move through her chest. Most people think he's romantic, she said. Most people are not paying attention, Wallace said. And what about Jane? What did you think of her? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lamp rather than at her. I thought she was the only honest person in the whole book, he said. Everyone else was performing something. She was just herself, even when it cost her. The room was very quiet. Outside, a nighthawk called across the dark pasture. Yes, Maggie said softly, that is exactly right. He picked up his hat. He stood. He seemed to become aware all at once of what had just happened, of the comfortable ease that had crept in between them without permission, and she watched something close down in his face, shutters pulling over windows. Good night, he said. Good night, she said. He went out. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at her book. She was in very serious trouble, and she knew it. The trouble compounded the following week when she found the hidden ledger. She had asked Wallace, with careful practicality, whether she could review the ranch's financial records, pointing out that her experience with the store accounts might be useful. He had agreed, somewhat stiffly, and left her a box of ledgers on the kitchen table. She had spent 2 evenings working through them, finding them generally sound but for a few inefficiencies she had already noted. It was in the 3rd ledger, tucked between 2 pages, that she found a letter she had not been meant to see. She knew immediately she had not been meant to see it. It was personal, clearly personal, written in a woman's handwriting she did not recognize and addressed simply to Wallace. She should not have read it. She read one line before she stopped herself, but one line was enough. The line read, If you cannot bring yourself to love me in return, then please do not pretend you ever tried. She closed the ledger carefully. She put it back in the box. She sat very still at the kitchen table and felt the weight of other people's pain pressing down into this house, absorbed into the adobe walls over 2 years, and she understood something she had not understood before. His first wife, Clara, had not died of fever. She had died loving a man who had already shut himself down so completely that she had not been able to reach him, and he had been living in the ruins of that guilt ever since. She did not say anything to him about the letter, but she watched him differently after that. She noticed, for instance, that he never sat idle, not for one moment. When there was no physical task requiring his hands, he found one. He sharpened things that were already sharp. He oiled hinges that moved easily. He walked the fence lines alone in the evening when there was no reason to. He kept himself in constant motion, because motion was the only thing standing between him and whatever was inside him that he refused to look at. She noticed that he flinched, almost imperceptibly, when she laughed. Not in displeasure, in surprise, as though laughter in this house had become so foreign that his body treated it like a sound from another country. She noticed that he always made sure there was enough firewood before he went to bed, stacked neatly by the kitchen door, even when the weather was still warm enough that she did not need it. He never mentioned this. He simply did it. She was trying very hard not to find him devastating. She was failing at a steady and consistent rate. The crisis came, as crises in small frontier towns tended to do from outside. His name was Garrett Sully, and he arrived in Harlow at the beginning of September with 4 men and an air of casual menace. Maggie first heard about him from Pearl Harmon when she went to the mercantile for supplies, and Pearl's voice was clipped and quiet in the way that meant she was frightened but working to sound matter-of-fact. "He is a land broker," Pearl said. "Though that is a polite name for what he actually does. He has been buying up ranches along the river corridor. Some folks sold willingly. Some folks were encouraged to sell in ways that were less willing." "The Box B is on the river," Maggie said. Pearl looked at her steadily. "Yes, it is." Maggie drove home carefully thinking. She found Wallace in the barn and she told him what Pearl had said directly and without embellishment, which was her way. He was quiet for a moment, curry brush moving along the flank of his bay horse. Then he said, "I know about Sully, and I am not selling." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had already had this conversation with himself and settled the matter. "He may not take that as a final answer," Maggie said. Wallace looked at her then, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, not the usual guardedness, something almost like appreciation for the way she came at a problem straight. "No," he agreed. "He likely won't." Sully came to the ranch 3 days later. Maggie was in the kitchen garden when he rode up, 4 men behind him, all of them well armed. He was a broad man, handsome in a heavy way, with expensive clothes and a gold watch chain and the practiced smile of a person who expected his charm to carry weight. He did not look at Maggie when she came to the porch, because she was a woman and therefore not the person who mattered. This was his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming Wallace would be alone. Maggie had ridden to the Harmon ranch the day before, told Pearl what was coming, and asked Pearl's husband, George, to spread the word. When Sully arrived, Wallace was standing on the porch flanked by his 4 ranch hands, and 2 of the neighboring ranchers had happened to ride over that morning for no particular stated reason. Sully pulled up short. He smiled wider and said his lines about fair market value and the future of the territory and progress and opportunity. Wallace listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, in the same flat, certain voice he had used in the barn, "The Box B is not for sale." Sully's smile did not waver, but his eyes did something calculated and cold. He said almost pleasantly, "I find that answers sometimes change, given enough time." "Mine won't," Wallace said. Sully looked at the assembled men. He looked at Maggie, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded in front of her, and he reassessed with visible irritation the situation he had ridden into. He touched his hat brim, turned his horse, and rode back down the road with his men behind him. The neighboring ranchers stayed for coffee, and a long, quiet conversation about what organized resistance to Sully's campaign might look like. That evening, after everyone had gone, Wallace found Maggie at the kitchen table writing a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe outlining Sully's activities as they had been described to her, asking for an inquiry and noting the names of 3 ranchers who had been pressured to sell under duress. He read over her shoulder. She did not look up. "My handwriting is clearer than yours," she said, "and I know how to write a formal petition. You can sign it." The silence behind her was very long. Then he said quietly, Maggie. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up then because she could not stop herself. He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for, something raw, something he was clearly not comfortable with at all. He looked like a man who had opened a door he had been keeping locked for a long time and was now face to face with what was on the other side. "Thank you," he said. "You would have done the same," she said. "No," he said, and something in his voice was very quiet and very honest, more honest than she had heard from him yet. "I would not have thought of the petition. I would have stood on the porch and been stubborn and called that sufficient. It would not have been sufficient. No." He pulled out the other chair and sat down. "No, it would not have been." He looked at the letter she had been writing. He looked at the careful, clear lines of her handwriting, the logical organization of her argument, the thoroughness with which she had documented everything. And then he looked at her face for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "I brought books." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the family of one, and it transformed his face in a way that did something entirely unfair to Maggie's composure. "Yes," he said, "you did." They sat across the table from each other in the lamplight, and Maggie finished the letter and Wallace read it through once more and signed it at the bottom, and somehow in the space of that hour the nature of the air between them changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the quality of the silence became different. It became the silence of two people comfortable enough to share it, rather than two strangers cautiously navigating their own separate territories. She mailed the letter the next morning. Sully's men were the next problem. Two of them came back a week later, not to the ranch but to Harlow itself, and they followed Maggie from the mercantile to the post office in a way that was designed to frighten rather than to threaten directly. She walked steadily, did not hurry, completed her errand and drove home. But her hands on the reins were not entirely steady, and when she got back to the ranch Wallace was there unexpectedly, having come back from the south pasture early, and he took one look at her face. What happened? She told him. He was very still in the specific way she had learned, meant he was angrier than he was showing. He asked her one careful question about which men they had been, what they looked like, and she described them precisely. Then he said, "I will go into town tomorrow." "I am not asking you to fight anyone," Maggie said. "I know you are not." He looked at her. "But I am telling you I will go into town tomorrow." "All right," she said. He went into town the next day. She did not know exactly what he said to Sully's men, but Denny Kraft, who had ridden along, reported back at supper with barely concealed admiration that the boss had walked into the saloon and had a conversation with the two men in question that was, technically speaking, entirely civil, and that the two men in question had left Harlow on the afternoon stage. He did not even raise his voice, Denny said, clearly impressed. Maggie was surprised to find that this was more unsettling than if he had raised his voice. There was something about a man who could project that level of absolute intent in complete quietness that was very difficult to ignore. 2 nights later she woke at 2 in the morning to a sound in the house. She lay still for a moment listening. It was not an intruder. It was the sound of someone moving quietly in the kitchen, and then the distinctive clink of a coffee cup. She got up, put on her robe, and went to the kitchen doorway. Wallace was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of coffee, and what she could tell, even without the lamp, was the stiff, controlled posture of someone who could not sleep. She lit the lamp. He looked up at her, and because it was 2 in the morning and neither of them had their guard fully operational, she saw everything on his face that he usually kept hidden. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the specific isolated pain of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She went to the stove and made another cup of coffee. She sat down at the table. They were quiet for a while. The lamp made a small, warm circle of light around them. Outside, the New Mexico night was absolutely still. "I dream about her sometimes," he said suddenly. He did not look at her. "Clara. I dream that she is asking me why I could not try harder." Maggie did not say anything quickly. She waited to make sure he was finished, And I do not have an answer in the dream, he said. I never have one. What do you think the answer is? She asked, gently. He turned the cup in his hands. I think I told myself I was being practical. That marriage was a partnership and not a performance, and that love was what you did rather than what you felt, and that she ought to understand that. He paused. I think I was wrong. What changed? Maggie asked. He was quiet for a very long time. He looked at the table. He looked at his coffee. He looked finally at her. I think you changed it, he said, in the same flat, honest voice he used for everything, except that it was not flat now. There was something underneath it that was entirely unguarded. I think watching you live in this house, the way you go at things, the letter, the accounts, the kitchen garden, the way you stood on that porch and looked at Sully like he was a problem you had already solved, I think it showed me what it looks like when a person is actually whole, when they are not performing and not hiding and not running from themselves. And it made me realize that I have been doing all three for 2 years. Maggie's throat was very tight. You are not a coward, she said quietly. Cowards do not face things directly. They just choose to face the wrong things. He looked at her. You have been facing the ranch, she said. The fence lines and the accounts and Sully on the porch. You face every practical thing head-on because if you are always busy solving practical problems, you do not have to solve the other kind. The silence stretched. Yes, he said finally, very quietly. You did not fail Clara, Maggie said, but I think you know you closed off from her, and I think the reason you could not open was not because you did not care. I think it was because you cared about something and lost it before her, and you made a decision somewhere that you were not going to let yourself be that vulnerable again. He looked at her very sharply. She met his eyes steadily. You do not have to tell me what it was. But I think there was something before Clara, something that taught you being open was not safe. The silence was very long. The lamp burned steadily. Somewhere outside a coyote called distant and thin. My brother, he said. He died when I was 22. We were ranching together up in Colorado. An accident with a horse. He paused. He was the only person I had ever told everything to. After he died, I decided that was the problem. That telling everything to someone gave them the power to take everything when they left. And so you never told anything to anyone again, Maggie said. Not until right now, he said. The words fell into the lamplit silence and settled there. Maggie looked at him across the table and felt something so large and so certain that it frightened her. This was not the convenient warmth she had been trying to manage and contain. This was the real thing, the kind of thing she had read about in Jane Eyre and half believed in and half feared, the kind of thing that asked everything of you and left no part of you unchanged. Wallace, she said. Maggie, he said. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Just that. Just her hand on his hand in the lamplight in the kitchen of a ranch in Harlow, New Mexico, at 2 in the morning in the fall of 1882. He turned his hand over. His fingers closed around hers. They sat like that until the coffee was cold and the lamp burned lower and the night began its slow turn toward dawn. He did not move toward her and she did not move toward him, because they were both people who understood that some things needed to be arrived at slowly and with full awareness. But when she finally stood to go back to bed, he stood too, and he held her hand for one moment longer and he said, "Good night, Maggie," and his voice was entirely different from any voice she had heard from him yet. It was open, unguarded. It was the voice of a man who had just, for the first time in a long time, told the truth. She lay in her bed for the rest of the night and looked at the ceiling and tried to remember why she had been so committed to not falling in love with this man. She could not remember at all. The days that followed had a different quality. It was subtle at first, visible only to the two people inside it. He began coming in for lunch instead of eating something from the saddlebag and staying in the field. He began to talk at supper, not extensively, but steadily, in the methodical way he did everything, telling her about the south pasture fence repair or the mare who was close to foaling or the water table situation in the dry season. Small, practical things, but he was talking to her. He was choosing to be in the same room. He was, she realized, doing the thing he had never done before, building something deliberately instead of simply enduring. She, for her part, stopped editing herself. She had been careful since her arrival not to occupy too much space, not to push too hard, not to give him more of herself than his stated preferences seemed to allow for. She stopped being careful. She told him what she was reading and what she thought about it. She told him her opinion of Sully's business model, which was detailed and scathing. She told him about her father's store and the loan that had taken it and the way she had stood in the empty back office at the end and felt the floor drop out from under her life. He listened to this last part with the close, still attention he gave to fencing issues and water rights, which was to say with his whole mind, and when she finished he said, "You should not have had to carry that alone." "No," she agreed, "but I did not have anyone to carry it with." "You do now," he said, simply, matter-of-factly, like an observation about weather. But when she looked at him, his eyes were entirely serious and what was in them was entirely clear. "Yes," she said, "I do now." The petition to the Territorial Land Office came back in early October with a letter from a federal land agent named Morse who said the irregularities she had documented were being investigated, and that Sully's land acquisition activities in the Harlow corridor had been flagged for audit. Pearl Harmon cried when Maggie brought her a copy. George Harmon shook Maggie's hand for a long time and then turned and shook Wallace's hand. "Between you two, you have done in 8 weeks what the rest of us could not do in 8 months, George said. "Maggie wrote the letter," Wallace said. "Wallace stood on the porch," Maggie said. George looked back and forth between them with a slow, warm smile. "You two are going to do just fine," he said. Sully himself left the territory by November, quietly and without ceremony, which was a satisfying end to a man who had caused a great deal of trouble. The 2 neighboring ranches he had pressured into signing over their land were embroiled in legal proceedings to recover them, and Maggie, who had discovered a latent talent for advocacy that she had not fully known she possessed, wrote 2 more letters on their behalf over the course of the winter. The first real snow came in December. It was not heavy by Eastern standards, but it covered the red and gold New Mexico landscape in white and made the mornings very still and clean. Maggie stood on the front porch wrapped in a wool shawl watching the snow fall on the morning of December the 14th, and Wallace came up beside her. He had a second cup of coffee in his hand, and he held it out to her, and she took it, and they stood side by side watching the snow. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She had learned, a particular quality of quietness before he said something important, a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. "I want to ask you," he said carefully, "whether this is what you wanted when you answered that notice. I know what the notice said. I know what I offered you." He paused. "I know it was not much." She looked at him. He was looking at the snow. "It was enough to begin with," she said. "And now?" He turned to look at her. His face was the most open she had ever seen it, and she knew, looking at him, that this question had cost him considerably, that asking it had required the dismantling of defenses he had built over years, and that he was standing here asking it anyway because he had decided she was worth the risk. "Now," she said, "it is everything I needed without knowing I needed it." He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail. He turned to face her fully. He was not a man who made dramatic gestures. He was a man who put firewood by the door before it was needed and fixed things before they broke and thought carefully before he spoke. And so what he did was reach out and take her face in his hands slowly, with the same careful steadiness he gave to everything, and he tilted her face up to his, and he waited one long breath to make absolutely sure she was not going to step back. She did not step back. He kissed her. It was not tentative or performative. It was honest and warm and exactly like him, direct and careful and real, and Maggie pressed her free hand against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palm, and thought that this was the least practical thing she had ever done and the most correct. When he lifted his head, his eyes were very dark and very clear, and he said, quietly, "I am sorry it took me so long to get here." "You are exactly on time," she said. He pulled her against him, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood on the porch in the December snow, and neither of them needed to say anything else for a while, because some things do not need words, and this was one of them. The winter was a good one, which is to say it was hard and cold and full of work, and Maggie did not mind any of it. The ranch demanded constant effort in the cold months, water lines that needed watching, cattle that needed extra feed, firewood that needed to be constant and sufficient. She and Wallace worked alongside each other with a naturalness that struck both of them as surprising and inevitable all at once. She moved into his room in February. This happened with characteristic simplicity. He asked, she said yes, and that was that. What it meant for the nature of their marriage did not require extensive discussion, because it was by that point entirely clear to both of them what they meant to each other. Spring came early and warm to Harlow that year, and with it came the mare's foal, a copper-bright filly that Maggie named Penelope, and that Wallace pretended to find impractical as a name for a horse, though she noticed he used it. She also noticed, in April, that she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast on a Wednesday, because Wednesday was when she was most certain, setting the information on the table between them the way she set everything between them. Directly, without ceremony, without drama. Wallace was very still for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a full, unguarded smile, the kind she had seen on his face only a handful of times, and that still had the power to stop her thinking entirely, and he said, "Well, well," she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and outside the window the New Mexico spring was coming in all green and gold, and the mountains were losing their last snow, and it was one of those mornings that feels, even as you are inside it, like something you will remember for the rest of your life. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. Also honestly. "But not more than I am glad." She squeezed his hand. "That is the right answer," he laughed. Fully, without restraint, for the first time she had heard from him, and she discovered that his laugh was warm and low and entirely transformed his face, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life finding new reasons to hear it. The pregnancy was not easy in the sense that the summer of 1883 was very hot, and the ranch did not slow down for the heat. Maggie was pragmatic about it in the way she was pragmatic about everything, managing what she could manage and asking for help when she needed it, which was a thing she had not always been good at but was learning. Wallace, for his part, became a person she occasionally had to argue with about how much she was allowed to do. This was not unpleasant. It was, in fact, one of their richest sources of conversation, because they were both people with firm opinions, and the discussions that resulted were precise and spirited and always ended in some reasonable compromise that satisfied both of them, more or less. "I can still make the drive to town," she said in July. "I can make the drive to town," he said. "You have work here. The work will wait, Wallace, Maggie." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the mutual exasperation of two very similar people who had just discovered they were very similar. "We will go together," she said. "That is what I was going to suggest," he said. "You were not. I was getting there." She drove the wagon to town sitting next to him in the high morning air with the mountains purple and clear to the south, and she thought about the stagecoach ride 3 days from Abilene that had brought her here, about the woman she had been then, with $31 and a carpetbag, and the reasonable, practical hope of a new life. She looked at Wallace's hands on the reins, steady and unhurried. She looked at the ring on her own left hand, a simple gold band he had bought from the Harmon Mercantile without telling her, and presented to her one morning at breakfast with exactly no fanfare and exactly the right expression on his face. She thought about the word practical. She had thought once that she knew what it meant. She thought she understood it better now. Practical was being honest even when it was inconvenient. Practical was acknowledging what you needed instead of pretending you did not need it. Practical was making a life with someone not because they were safe or simple, but because they were right, and the right thing was always worth the cost. Their son was born on the 17th of September, 1883. He was born in the morning, before the sun was fully up, and the midwife who had ridden out from Harlow said she had rarely attended a calmer birth, which was perhaps an exaggeration but not a complete one. Maggie bore pain the way she bore most things, which was to say directly and without theatrics, and with a great deal of focused determination. Wallace was not permitted in the room, which was the convention, and he sat outside the bedroom door on the hallway floor for 6 hours, and Denny Kraft sat with him, and they did not talk much, but Denny was there, and Maggie was glad of it for his sake. When the midwife opened the door and told him he could come in, he came in slowly, like a man entering territory he was not sure he was worthy of. He looked at Maggie, who was exhausted and very pale and entirely triumphant, and then he looked at the child in her arms, and something happened in his face that was beyond her powers of description. "He has your ears," she said. "He has your expression," Wallace said, which was to say the baby was looking at the world with the focused, assessing attention of someone who was gathering information and would have opinions shortly. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He had thought about this. She could tell by the way he did not hesitate. "Thomas," he said, "after my brother." She looked at him. There were not tears on his face, but there was something very close to them, held in with the precision of a man who did not cry but understood fully that there were times it would not be wrong to do so. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." He sat on the edge of the bed next to her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and looked at his son with an expression of such complete and undisguised love that it was almost difficult to look at directly, like looking into the sun. "Thomas James Barker," he said quietly, trying the name out. "Hello." Thomas, who was exactly 20 minutes old and had very strong opinions about things already, made a small sound that seemed to indicate awareness. "Hello," Maggie said to her son, and felt the word settle into her like something she had always been holding a space for. The winter of 1883 was the quietest and best winter of Wallace Barker's adult life, which he did not say out loud because he was not a man given to that kind of declaration, but which Maggie knew without being told because she knew him now the way you know the land you have worked. Every slope, every stone, every place where the water goes when it rains. He would come in from the barn in the evenings and the house would be warm, and Thomas would be in the cradle by the fire, and Maggie would be at the table with a book or the accounts, and he would stop in the doorway for a moment before he came in, as though he needed one breath to absorb the fact that this was real. She noticed. She never mentioned it. It was not the kind of thing that needed to be mentioned. Their conversation in those months was the fullest it had ever been. They talked about the ranch's expansion possibilities, about a second pasture Wallace had been considering fencing, about Denny Kraft who had a girl in town he was trying to work up the courage to court, and who required considerable advice from both of them. They talked about the territorial situation, about the ongoing legal case involving Sully's land grabs, which had moved to federal court in Santa Fe, and in which the two pressured ranchers were likely to recover their properties. They talked about books, because Wallace had quietly borrowed her copy of the Odyssey and come to supper one evening with opinions about Odysseus that were characteristically sharp. "He is selfish," Wallace said with the authority of someone who had given this serious thought. "He spends 20 years failing to come home while Penelope holds everything together alone." "That is one reading," Maggie said, keeping her expression neutral. "It is the correct reading," he said. "I named the filly after her," Maggie said, "after Penelope." "I know," he said, and then, after a pause, "it was a good name." She looked at him. "For the horse," he added, but the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did. "Of course," she said. Thomas was a very decided child from the beginning, which made sense given his parentage. He had Wallace's stillness and Maggie's intensity, and by the time he was pulling himself upright on the furniture and watching everything with enormous dark eyes, it was clear to everyone who encountered him that he was collecting information constantly and would begin deploying it in ways that would require careful supervision. "He watched me fix the pump for 40 minutes this morning," Wallace reported one April morning. "Did not make a sound, just watched." "He is learning how it works," Maggie said. "He is 4 months old. He is very interested," Maggie said. Wallace looked at his son, who was looking back at him with great seriousness. "He has your brain," he said, with equal parts concern and admiration. "He has your patience," she said, "which is a very good thing because my brain without your patience would be a problem." He smiled at her. It was the smile she had come to think of as hers, the one that was not in public rotation, that she saw in the mornings and in the lamplight and in moments like this one, when his guard was fully down and he was simply himself, a man who had learned that being known was not the same as being lost. Spring returned to the Box B with all its familiar green and gold. The copper filly Penelope grew into something beautiful and headstrong, which Maggie found entirely appropriate. Denny Kraft finally spoke to his girl in town, a calm and pretty schoolteacher's daughter named Alice, and they were engaged by May. Maggie organized a dinner to celebrate this, which was the first social event held at the Box B in 3 years, and which was, by all accounts, a great success. Pearl Harmon pulled Maggie aside in the kitchen during the evening and pressed her hand warmly. "I remember when Wallace came in the day after Clara died," Pearl said quietly. "He came in for supplies and I asked him if he needed anything else and he just looked at me like the question did not compute, like he had forgotten entirely how to be asked." She paused. "He is different now. He is here again." "You did that?" "He did it himself," Maggie said. "I just stayed in the room." Pearl squeezed her hand. "Staying in the room is everything sometimes." Summer came hot and full, and Maggie found on a Tuesday morning in July that she was once again pregnant. She told Wallace at breakfast, and he once again went still and then smiled the full smile, but this time without any residual disbelief in it, as though now he had enough evidence to simply allow himself to be glad without bracing for the possibility that the ground might move. "Thomas is going to be a terrible older brother," he said. "He is going to be an excellent older brother," Maggie said. "He will be very thorough about it." "That is what I said," said Wallace. Their daughter was born in March of 1885. They named her Ruth, after Maggie's grandmother, and she was small and loud and absolutely certain from the first moment that she was the most important person in any room she occupied, which she was. Thomas regarded her with the focused solemnity of a 20-month-old conducting an audit, and after approximately 2 days he appeared to reach a conclusion and allowed her to be relevant. After a week he would not leave her side. Wallace held Ruth the evening she was born the way he had held Thomas, with the careful, stunned reverence of someone handling something precious and improbable, and he looked at Maggie and she looked at him, and the thing between them was too large for any word she knew in English, so she did not try to find one. They had built this. 2 people who had come to each other out of practicality, out of circumstance, out of letters written across 600 miles of prairie, had built this warm and complicated and entirely real life, and it fit around them the way well-made things do, precisely and without waste, every part necessary. Sully's federal case concluded in the fall of 1885, with both pressured ranches returned to their original owners and Sully facing fines that effectively ended his land acquisition operations in the territory. The Harlow corridor stabilized. 2 new families arrived and settled north of town. The town itself grew slowly and in the right direction, acquiring a small school and a doctor's office, and a proper church with a bell that could be heard on still evenings all the way to the Box B. Maggie became, by informal but universal consensus, the person in Harlow who knew how to handle paperwork. She wrote petitions, organized community meetings, corresponded with the territorial government on behalf of landowners who did not know how to navigate the bureaucratic systems themselves. Wallace, who had always operated on the understanding that practical competence was the highest form of value, watched his wife do all of this with the expression of someone who had been given something much larger than they had known to ask for, and was still, several years on, in the process of absorbing what that meant. In the winter of 1886, when Thomas was 3 and Ruth was almost 2, and the house was full of noise and movement in a way that no one who had known the Boxby 4 years earlier would have recognized, Wallace came in late one evening from checking the cattle in the north pasture and found Maggie at the kitchen table with both children asleep against her, one on each side and a book open in her lap. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. "Come in before you let the cold in," she said, which was how she said many things practically and with warmth underneath. He came in. He took off his coat. He lifted Thomas, who was deeply asleep and did not object, and carried him to his bed and tucked him in with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times and valued it each time. He came back and lifted Ruth, who made a small sound of protest and then relented, and carried her to her room and settled her under her blankets. He came back to the kitchen and sat down across from Maggie. She had closed her book. She was looking at him with the clear, direct regard that had once made him feel seen in a way he was not prepared for, and now simply felt like home. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was, she recognized, doing the thing he did when he was going to say something true and important and slightly difficult for him, gathering himself with the same steady patience he brought to everything. "When I wrote that notice," he said, "I told myself I was being sensible, that I needed someone practical, that the ranch needed that I needed a certain kind of arrangement. And I told myself that wanting more than that was a kind of foolishness I had already paid too much for." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand now that I was wrong, not about needing someone capable and honest. I was right about that. But I was wrong about it being enough. I was wrong that it could be the whole of it." Maggie did not speak. "You are everything I said I needed," he said, "and you are everything I said I did not need, and it turns out those were always the same list." He looked at her steadily, with the directness of a man who had taken something buried and hidden for years and brought it fully into the light. "I love you, Maggie. I have loved you for a long time. I do not think I have ever said it plainly." The kitchen was very still. "You have said it in about 800 other ways," she said, "but no, you have not said it plainly." "I am saying it now," he said, "plainly." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was firm and warm and entirely herself. "I love you, Wallace," she said. "I have loved you since the night you told me Rochester was manipulative and self-serving." He looked at her. "That was very early," he said. "I know," she said. "I was very annoyed about it." He laughed. The warm, low laugh that still made her feel like she had won something. He pulled her hand toward him and held it in both of his. "I am sorry it took me so long," he said. "You said that before," she said. "In the snow, on the porch." "I will probably keep saying it," he said, "for a while." "Then I will keep telling you," she said, "that you were exactly on time." He stood up and came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her, his arms around her in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning low, and the New Mexico winter pressing cold against the windows, and their children asleep in their rooms, and everything that had been broken and hidden and carefully locked away now open and tended and real. She rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat and thought about the woman who had stood at a community board in Abilene with $31 and no plan, and had read 12 sentences on a piece of paper and made a choice. She thought that woman had been, perhaps, smarter than she knew, that she had recognized something in those 12 sentences, not a romantic promise, not a grand gesture, but the honest, unmistakable shape of a man who had not yet learned that he was allowed to want more than practical. She had thought on that stagecoach that she was going west to find a new life. She had gone west and found a whole one. Spring came again to the Boxby, the 7th spring since Maggie Sawyer had ridden into Harlow on the afternoon stage and climbed down from the coach with a carpet bag and 3 books. The red-blossomed desert willows were coming in along the water line. The filly Penelope, long since grown and bred, was running the south pasture with her own 2-year-old colt. Thomas, now 4, was following his father around the barn and learning the names of tools with the dedicated focus of a scholar. Ruth, who was 2, had decided that she preferred to spend her time with Penelope's colt and had strong opinions about this that no one had yet been able to argue her out of. Denny Kraft and his Alice had married the previous fall and were expecting their first child in June, and Alice had asked Maggie to be present at the birth, which Maggie had agreed to and which she suspected had something to do with her calm and competent manner in emergencies, a trait she attributed to having dealt with a great deal, and found that most things could be survived if approached directly. The Territorial Land Agent Morse had written to Maggie in January to inform her that the petition she had filed in 1882 had been cited as a foundational document in 3 subsequent federal land protection cases in the New Mexico Territory, and that her approach to documenting the abuses had been recommended as a model for similar efforts. She had read this letter at breakfast and then passed it to Wallace without comment. He had read it. He had looked at her. "You are remarkable," he said. "I wrote a letter," she said. "You wrote a letter," he agreed, "the way a blacksmith makes a horseshoe, with exactly the right material at exactly the right temperature in exactly the right shape." She had looked at him with great suspicion. "That was nearly a metaphor. I read your copy of Homer," he said. "I think it is affecting me." She had laughed so hard that Thomas had come running to see what was funny, and Wallace had told him that his mother was laughing at a metaphor, and Thomas had considered this information gravely and said, "What is a metaphor?" And they had spent the next 20 minutes explaining literary devices to a 4-year-old, which was not something either of them had expected from their Wednesday morning, but which seemed, in retrospect, entirely appropriate for the life they had built. On the last morning of April, when the desert was all sage and blossoms, and the mountains were clear blue against the sky, Maggie stood on the porch of the Box B with a cup of coffee, watching the early light move across the land. She was 31 years old. She had a husband who loved her with the same steady, irrefutable commitment he brought to fencing and water rights and checking the harness, and who had learned, slowly and at some cost to his considerable pride, to say so plainly. She had 2 children with Wallace's patience and her own determination, and an amount of combined personality that was already, in their small persons, almost more than a house could contain. She had a kitchen garden that was coming in beautifully. She had a legal archive of letters that had protected land across a significant portion of the territory. She had a horse named Penelope who bit anyone she did not respect and had excellent judgment. She had a life that was, by any reasonable measure, entire. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn. Wallace came to stand beside her. He had her second cup of coffee in his hand and he handed it to her, and she handed him her first cup because his was better, and he took it without comment because this was a system they had developed and it worked. He looked at the land. The morning light was doing something very specific to the Manzano Mountains, turning them from blue to gold, and she had watched this happen many mornings by now and it still moved her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. It was a question he had learned to ask. It had taken him a while. "I was thinking," she said, "about the notice you wrote on the community board in Abilene." She paused. "I was thinking you wrote it looking for something specific, practical, contained." "Yes," he said. "And I wrote back because I thought that was what I had to offer." She turned her cup in her hands. "I did not understand then that you had not included yourself in the accounting." He was quiet for a moment. The light moved on the mountains. "I did not know I was available to be included," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains with the clean, open expression she had come, over years, to think of as his truest face, the one that had no performance in it. Just Wallace Barker, standing in the morning light on his porch, accountable to himself and to the land and to the woman beside him. "You were always available," she said. You just needed someone to sit down at the table with you. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she loved. Sit down and bring books, he said. The books were essential, she said. The books, he said, were the best thing about your carpetbag. She laughed. He smiled. Inside the house, Thomas could be heard beginning his morning negotiations with the world, and Ruth was contributing commentary from her room that was incoherent but emphatic. Wallace put his arm around Maggie's shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together on the porch of the Box B on the last morning of April in 1888. In Harlow, New Mexico Territory, in the wide and complicated and entirely real life they had made from 12 sentences and a practical arrangement, and the radical act of two people deciding that they were worth more than they had been asked to give. The mountains turned gold, the children woke, the day came in, and it was good. It was exactly, entirely, practically and impractically and wholly good.